Well, welcome to this webinar on behalf of the Colleges of Alberta Professional Foresters and Forest Technologists. My name is Cynthia Carrolls, and I'm an associate with the law firm of Miller Thompson in Edmonton. I'm pleased to be your host today as we explore some issues around professional competency. And with me today is Brian Curiel, who's a partner in our Edmonton law firm. Brian acts as general counsel to a number of professional associations, and he's assisted a number of professions in obtaining their freestanding legislation. He's also pursued a broad spectrum of initiatives for professional associations under the Professional Occupational Associations Registration Act. So he is a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and we're very thankful to have you here and to join us today.
I'm really pleased to be here, Cynthia.
Now, as two lawyers sitting in a room, the first thing we always like to do is try to find some definitions. So why don't we start there with a definition of competency itself in the context of a profession.
Okay, so really what we're talking about with competency, and it's changed a lot in the past 20 years. 20 years ago, what professions looked at was the entry requirements. What education do you have? What piece of paper, what degree? And once you're in, and that was the end of it. And professional, self-regulating professions, professional legislation has changed dramatically in the past 20 years. That's no longer the case. Now it's a continuing competence model. So you not only have to, at the entry level, have competence, you have to maintain that competence throughout your career. So it really has evolved in the past 20 years. So if we're going to look at definitions, the Regulated Forestry Profession Act defines competence. And it's defined as it is in virtually all of the newer legislation in Alberta. Competence is the combined knowledge, skills, abilities, and judgment required to provide professional services. So it's not just the education, not just the technical training, the theory that you had originally. It's much more than that. So look at those four things that they talked about. Knowledge. Well, you come out of whatever program you've taken in your profession, and you've got a certain level of knowledge, but you have to build on that knowledge throughout your career.
Yeah.
Skills. Skills are really something that you don't acquire in university, and that's something you acquire after you finish your program.
Right.
So that's the continuing competence model. Abilities and judgment. And judgment, you can't develop judgment anywhere except in the practice.
Exactly.
And so it's been quite an evolution for professional legislation coming from just what's it take to get in the door to now, throughout your career, you have to have all of those things. Knowledge, skills, judgment.
So what does that look like then in the real world?
Well, you know, in the real world, we're looking at a couple of things. We used to talk about exclusive scope of practice, and now we talk about no longer restricted activities. So exclusive scope of practice said, a doctor can only do this, and a nurse can only do that. You had certain things you could do.
And only they could do.
Right. Now we're seeing that change. Dental hygienists can now give you the freezing. Used to be the dentist had to do that. And all of that's based on competence. So a dental hygienist, before they can give you the freezing, has to take additional training. And they have to have certification in that area in order to be able to do it. So if you're competent in that area, you can practice in that area. So that's one of the big areas and one of the big changes we've seen. Technology evolves, training evolves, new technologies allow people to do something that maybe they couldn't 20 years ago.
So you've been obviously very involved in legislation of this. Tell me how it actually is regulated. How do you regulate competence?
Well, it's difficult. And so what we're seeing professions doing is developing a continuing competence program. And different professions do that much differently. But there's really two ways that you can enforce competence. One is through the discipline process, and the other is through the continuing competence program. And so it used to be that you just had this entry level to get in, and then you were in the profession forever unless you were disciplined. Mm-hmm. If you did something bad, you could be disciplined and thrown out of the profession or have sanctions. now there's this in-between thing. It doesn't have to be those two extremes, just entry and throwing you out if you do something
Right.
bad. We've got continuing competence in the middle. And so a continuing competence program will require professionals to demonstrate each year that they're learning, that they're growing, that they're developing, that they're keeping up with things.
Staying current.
Staying
Things are
current.
changing so fast.
Exactly right. And so once they do that, then they have to prove it or keep evidence of it for their profession. And there can be practice reviews or practice audits. Some professions do that, some don't, where they can come in and do an audit or a review to make sure that you're maintaining your competence. So we've now got this new area in the past 10, 20 years where it isn't just the entry and the exit that we deal with, but we deal with practice in between.
Okay. So it used to be like what you were saying is you would come in and then you would leave, and you were a professional during that entire period of time. So this is something new. Can you explain why it is so important to be providing and proving your competency throughout the course of your career?
Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons. You want to keep pace. You want to keep up to date because, as we were just saying, new technology, new techniques, new knowledge comes to us. And you shouldn't just have the knowledge you learned 30 years ago when you did your schooling. You want to keep current with that. You can enhance your skills. You can develop as a professional. You can improve yourself. So, for instance, as lawyers, when we go to law school, we learn about contract law. Mm-hmm. and you know, what are the items that you have to have in every contract? You have to have the property defined, you have to have the parties defined, you have to have the price defined. Well, that's great theory, but you get out of law school and you start dealing with all sorts of complex and different contracts, and you'll find there's a lot more to it. You have to learn a lot more, and so that's what the continuing competence is. So you've got a very base level when you come out of your training program, but the more experience and the different areas you practice in will give you specialized knowledge. So we'll see lawyers that will specialize in different areas. And the same thing, I mentioned dental hygienists that have to have certifications to give freezing.
Yeah, that's a great example.
And same thing with foresters. And in the forestry industry, if you want to be an expert in wetlands or in wildlife or a specific area, then you need to be competent in that area.
Because it's such a broad area.
Exactly. And so the day of the generalist is really coming to an end. And we're getting more and more specialized just because so much volume of knowledge is out there now.
So tell me then, I guess, how these professional competencies will tie into the mandatory continuing competence programs or the program reviews.
Yeah. So one of the reasons for doing it is to avoid that whole discipline process.
Yeah, no kidding.
But aside from that, there's this ongoing continuing competence. So and every profession does it a little bit different. Some will say you need a certain number of hours in courses. Others will say that you have to prove to us that you've done something to grow and learn and expand as a professional, that you aren't just staying the same. Stagnating would be the way to describe it. So really, that's where you do it. And so on an annual basis, generally with most professions, some are every 2 or 3 years, but most of them are on an annual basis, where you have to demonstrate that you're competent. And that will be through an explanation of the extra training you're taking, or it can even be in your work. You can increase your competency through areas that you work in. As you work in that area, you learn more about that area. But the idea is you have to be able to prove that. So you have to keep records of it and so on.
Work with mentors.
Right. Working with mentors. Self-learning is fine. Reading. You do some work in a new area and you expand your knowledge that way. And that's really what it's all about. Expanding your knowledge. Growing from that base level that you have when you come out of school. And growing as a professional.
I'm sure people were doing that before. They were growing, but you weren't required to.
Document it. You couldn't be disciplined for not doing it. Most professions will have discipline processes. If you don't do the continuing competence, you can be disciplined just by fact of that. So it's now monitored,
Yeah.
and it never was.
So, how does competence then tie into professional accountability or even sign offs in some of these restricted activities?
Well, so restricted activities really comes out of the exclusive use of exclusive scope of practice legislation.
Okay.
So there will be a certain list of activities that only certain people can do. But sign-offs are something that we see in many, many professions. So if you're going to, as an accountant, do an audit, and you'll sign off on that audit, or as a lawyer, if you're going to give an opinion and you sign off on that opinion. And in forestry, if you're going to sign off on a reclamation remediation or a wetland certificate or something, you need to be competent in that area before you're entitled to sign
In that
off.
particular
In that
area.
particular area. So continuing competence is critical in that aspect of professional conduct.
Okay. So, what do you think the value and importance is then of continuing competence in defending the professionalism?
Well, it's really critical in that if we even go back to that definition, we're talking about knowledge, skills, abilities, and judgment. And if you have to defend yourself, that's really what you're talking about. Did you act in a competent manner? Was your knowledge up to snuff? Were your skills appropriate? Did you have the right abilities? Did you exercise your judgment properly? And so if you've been doing continuing competence, you can prove that you have all of those items covered off.
Isn't it enough to just let your work speak for itself?
Yes, it will speak to your skills, but that's exactly why you want to do your continuing competence, because you want to demonstrate that your skills are up to snuff to today's standards, not to the standards of 20 years ago.
Well, I can tell you, as a member of a regulated profession myself, I've learned an awful lot from our conversation today. So thank you very much for this, Brian.
My pleasure.
It was very helpful. And on behalf of Miller Thompson as well, I'm Cynthia Carrolls, and I hope that this was of benefit to you as well.